I'm Alex Pault, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Talking Timepieces, where we talk about watch collecting and horology. This is just going to be a quick episode to explain a term that a lot of people use, and not too many people actually take the time to explain, so I figured I'd explain it here, and that's the Quartz Crisis. A lot of people refer to it, and people kind of know what it means, but it refers to a very specific period of time and a very specific series of marketplace actions that resulted in the current situation. In one sense, the Quartz Crisis was a crisis. In one sense, it was a trade war, a true trade war, marketplace acquisition, as it were. And in another sense, it was just evolutionary disruption that happens in every industry. Like currently electric vehicles are disrupting automotive's industry, and advanced microcontrollers and artificial intelligence, algorithms, machine learning is disrupting computing and edge computing in the cloud and all of those other fancy buzzwords, just advancing technology. And the Quartz Crisis essentially was part of that, frankly, because in the 50s, the Swiss, Japanese, and the Americans were all working on various ways to improve timekeeping using electronic means of timekeeping, because timekeeping is critically important. I did a video on it. Why is timekeeping important? One of the most basic reasons timekeeping is important is navigation. And if you have an accurate timepiece, you can navigate more accurately than your enemies could. And that's why the British, back in the 1700s, had the whole contest for a ship chronometer that could be carried on board a ship and be accurate enough to be able to establish longitude. Now, this action to research new timepieces was quite successful. One of the most notable timepieces to come out of the pre-Quartz Crisis, I could almost say, is the Bulova Accutron. Tuning fork watch. Probably seen the video for it. If not, you should check it out. I do a video on this watch as well. And the Accutron was a electronic watch, and it wound up actually being used by NASA in several of the electronic packages in various spacecraft, and even in the electronic packages left on the moon by the Apollo missions. But the Accutron wasn't really a challenge to the mechanical watch industry, because while being an electronically driven system in one sense, it was still at heart a mechanical system, because the electronics just got the tuning fork in motion. The clock was actually driven, or is actually driven, by the tuning fork's motion. So at the end of the day, an Accutron tuning fork watch is essentially an electromechanical watch, still mechanical. And so it didn't challenge the Swiss watch industry as much as the Quartz revolution, discovery did, because the Accutron kind of blended into the mechanical mindset of the market. Now, the aspect of the Quartz Crisis that improved the mechanical market was, prior to the disruption caused by the invention of quartz, watchmaking had kind of fallen into a bit of a rut. If you look at watches from the 70s, they have a lot of very similar case designs and face styles and the like, because back in the earlier days of watchmaking, a company, unless they were, a flagship high-end company like Cartier or a Rolex or something of those lines, Omega, most watch companies just picked cases and movements off the shelf. In fact, even Omega and Rolex used to just pick cases and movements off the shelf. Rolex became an in-house movement maker by buying the company that made their movements. It wasn't a stigma to have an aftermarket, off-the-shelf movement in your watch. I wouldn't say aftermarket, but I mean an off-the-shelf movement in your watch, like an ETA, or back in the day Unitas, which was absorbed by ETA, or Valjoux, which was also absorbed by ETA, which are why you hear people refer to Unitas movement or a Valjoux movement, but they're really ETA made. It's just that the legacy is from those earlier companies. Now, in the late 50s, Quartz Electronics were created. And in 1969, the Seiko Astron, December of 69, so almost literally at the dawn of the 1970s, in December of 69, the Seiko Astron, the first quartz watch, was created. Sorry for the siren. So in 1969, the Astron was created, and revolutionized the industry. A watch that was more accurate, and Seiko put it in a nice package. So you now had a truly disruptive product. You had a watch that was more accurate than the Swiss high horology houses. Seiko was a competent watch manufacturer, is a competent watch manufacturer, and put their watches together quite well. And so a person was given a choice of buy a several $1,000 Swiss watch or buy a several $100 Japanese watch. And so the Japanese watchmakers proceeded to drive the Swiss out of business. In fact, from the period, I believe, between the mid-'70s to the mid-'90s, roughly 2/3 of the Swiss watch industry just disappeared. Great companies, too, came and went. I mean, companies like Universal Genève and the like, some who kind of still live on in names that have been bought up by other companies. But for the great part of it, 2/3 of the Swiss watch industry disappeared during the Quartz Crisis, which is why they called it a crisis. I mean, it was actually a trade war in that the Japanese were taking market share, and successfully, from the Swiss. But the Quartz Crisis basically refers to the disruption to the Swiss watch industry caused by the competition of the Japanese quartz watches. Because it wasn't just simply quartz that caused the problem. If the Swiss had run with quartz watches more aggressively or more creatively, they might have been able to handle it better. But, for example, Omega stubbed their toe quite aggressively trying to be a quartz watch provider and lost face among the higher-end watch collectors because of it. Same thing with Tag Heuer, and same thing with quite a few other companies in the space. Even Rolex came out with a quartz watch at one point. And, I mean, who wants to buy a $5,000 electromechanical quartz watch? I have a video on the oyster quartz. It's a phenomenal piece, but $500 watch versus several $1,000 watch. And so that's what happened with the Quartz Crisis. The Japanese watch industry created a trade imbalance and took a significant portion of the Swiss market, because 2/3 of the Swiss watch market disappeared. I mean, makers disappeared, but the industry didn't go away. People didn't stop buying watches. People bought other watches. So it's not that the Quartz Crisis was a real crisis because of the invention of quartz. The Quartz Crisis was primarily a trade war between Japan and the Swiss over watches, and the Japanese used quartz watches as their weapon. Something very similar can be said today. Tourbillons, Chinese tourbillons are everywhere because the Chinese are competing with the Swiss in an area where normally they weren't getting competition, and that was in the area of the fine, high machine making. So, yes, Seiko makes mechanical watches, but they make them as, part of their general business. They're not trying to target anything specific within the Swiss hierarchy, as it were today, as much as just trying to make a great watch that is as good, if not better, than other watchmakers in the world. But the Chinese are specifically, targeting Swiss watchmaking in an interesting aspect with these low-priced, complicated mechanical watches that are out of China. So trade disruption is going to continue to happen. Right now, there's a trade disruption with smartwatches. A lot of people are wearing smartwatches and fewer people are wearing mechanical watches. So you could make the argument that the Quartz Crisis is still going on in some form today. It's just that because of the shakeup of the Quartz Crisis, because of the disruption in the marketplace, the Swiss watch industry rebounded and reinvented itself. Nicholas Hayek, he used to wear 4 watches at all times, rolled up the sleeves of his suit. He talked everybody into starting the Swatch Group. And partly because of the Swatch Group's invention of the Swatch, and partly because of the reorganization of the marketplace due to these acquisitions, a lot of Swiss watch companies embraced high-end horology, went to in-house movements, and the ones that didn't got more serious about the way they made their own products, and they might use an off-the-shelf movement, but then their case and their face is more of their own. But the reality is the watch industry is still in a bit of disruption. It's breaking into a high-end aspect that is not the nicest to think about, when you think about the ultra luxury watches in that entire environment. And then you've got the mainstream luxury pieces, the $3,000 to $8,000 watches, which is still pretty high end if you think about it, but is not considered that high end by the high-end watch industry. But for the mainstream, it's nice pieces. But even, as I said, those pieces are threatened by smartwatches today and smart devices. But the fact that watches are also, character and style, as well as a timekeeping tool, is one of the things that's keeping them alive. I mean, frankly, if you're in a room full of guys in T-shirts and jeans, the one wearing the Rolex is probably the executive, or the owner of the company or something along those lines, or very good salesperson. You never know. But the watches have created an aspect of themselves to help people with their jewelry-oriented style presentation. But the nice thing about a watch is it's got a movement and it's got horology in it, technology in it, and it, at the end of the day, still provides a very useful function. It tells the time, which we still need to this day. So that was the Quartz Crisis. So that was the Quartz Crisis, and frankly, it was just a trade war because quartz watches still exist and they're still encroaching into the marketplace, and smartwatches and smart devices are. But the mechanical watch industry rallied and is actually now stronger than it was because of the competition. So in one sense, the Quartz Crisis was very healthy. So if you have any other questions about the Quartz Crisis, or you want to know anything about specifics, leave questions in the comments and I'll be more than happy to answer them. So thanks for taking the time to hear me ramble. Please subscribe. It really helps. I'm so close to being able to live stream, and we can have these kinds of conversations in real time. You have a great day now.